Have you ever been dragged out of your childhood home by your own family, in the rain, just days after the funeral, because you dared to hold on to the truth? Here's what they didn't expect. Forged signatures, fake medical reports, and a forged will weren't enough to erase me. My father, Edward Weller, prepared for this. He hid a USB inside his pocket watch. What's on it? The trail they thought they'd buried. I'm Natalie, lawyer, only daughter Edward trusted, and this video is proof that the truth leaves fingerprints on bank transfers, audio memos, and emails they never thought anyone would find. In the next few minutes, I'll show you how I exposed a $12 million cover-up, dismantled a forged legal memo, and forced a courtroom to listen, armed with nothing but a letter, a voice recording, and a trail of corruption they left behind. This isn't fiction. There's court testimony, forensic data, even the family butler came forward. And if you think you're too small to fight power, watch this till the end. Because if you skip this, you might miss the proof that silence doesn't mean defeat. And legacy can't be erased when you remember everything. Before we dive into the story, let me learn a bit about you. If you're a charming lady, please leave the number 1 in the comments. And if you're a dashing gentleman, leave the number 2. This way I can send you a special greeting. Now let's start the story together.
I didn't cry. Not when my suitcase burst open, not when my father's hand clamped around my upper arm, shoving me out into the cold. The wind hit me like it had been waiting, sharp with rain and November's spite. My knees scraped the stone steps of Grayson Hill, and I heard the click before I saw it. The polished lid of the pocket watch flipping open as it hit the slate, landing just inches from my fingertips. Edward's watch. I reached for it first. The air smelled of rosemary scones. Margot must have warmed them again, like she always did for guests who never stayed. But I wasn't a guest. Not anymore. Inside, the grand foyer of Grayson Hill blurred behind the glass of the front door. High ceilings, marble floors. The chandelier Edward had restored by hand still caught the dim light. My parents' silhouettes loomed there. Margot stood perfectly still, arms crossed over her cream cardigan. Charles paced behind her like a trial attorney, rehearsing closing arguments. They hadn't even waited 2 days after the funeral. "You were supposed to collect your things," Margot said earlier, not looking up from her tablet. "I am," I'd answered, setting down the small jewelry box Edward had left me in the will. "This isn't your home," Charles cut in. "Not anymore. The estate is under legal review." "Probate doesn't erase signatures," I reminded him. "The documents are notarized. Edward's estate is mine." That's when Chloe walked in, barefoot, silk pajamas, holding a coffee she didn't make. "Oh," she said, blinking like I'd surprised her in her own kitchen. "You're still here." Still, as if I'd overstayed a welcome that never existed. She took a sip, leaned against the doorway like a scene from a show she thought she was starring in. "Look," she sighed, "this place was never really you, Nat. You were always more practical. Edward just had a soft spot." I looked at her then. She didn't flinch. That was new. Growing up, Chloe only looked at me to borrow things, notes, earrings, excuses. Today, she looked right through me. I turned away. Back to the guest room that used to be mine, the one with the view of the West Gardens. Half of it was already packed into a suitcase. I'd brought one bag. I thought that would be enough. I was wrong. It was Charles who snapped first. I just finished zipping up the last pouch when I felt his shadow stretch across the room. "You have 5 minutes," he said. I didn't answer. Just slipped Edward's cufflinks into a side pocket. When I stepped back into the hallway, he grabbed my arm, not hard, not soft. Enough. He didn't look angry. He looked like someone executing a task. "Don't touch me," I said quietly. He didn't let go. "Margot," he called out. "She's refusing to leave." "I'm not refusing. I'm done here." And then, without ceremony, he dragged me through the hallway I'd memorized as a child, the one I used to rollerblade down in socks when no one was looking. He yanked the front door open and shoved. I didn't scream. I thought of Edward, his voice steady on late nights when I doubted myself. "If they ever push you out," he used to say, "don't scream." Let them wonder what's coming. So I didn't scream. The suitcase fell apart before I hit the steps. My clothes, books, even a half-eaten protein bar spilled across the stone like discarded inventory. I crouched, knees throbbing, and collected them in silence. That's when the watch landed. It bounced once, then clicked open. I recognized the engraving, "To ECW for every minute you made count." I picked it up with both hands. Behind me, the door clicked shut. I didn't look back. Rain soaked the hem of the blazer I'd worn to the funeral, the same one Edward had gifted me the day I passed the bar. "Wear it to anything that matters," he said. It was charcoal gray, a little too big on the shoulders, warm like him. I hadn't changed out of it. I pulled the collar higher and stepped off the porch. A flash of memory caught me off guard, the echo of applause and fairy lights. Chloe's 16th birthday. She'd gotten a red convertible with a bow the size of my ego. Everyone cheered, held up phones. Edward smiled but stayed quiet beside me. That same night, he handed me a prepaid gift card tucked in an envelope. "Straight A's deserve something," he'd said. I used it to buy textbooks and a pair of shoes I still wear to interviews. Chloe got champagne. I got practicality. But Edward always looked proudest when I didn't ask for anything. The sky was spitting now. Rain slicked the walkways, coated the sharp tips of rose bushes along the driveway. I held the watch in my hand and whispered, "You'll regret this." No one was listening, but that wasn't the point. I walked toward the bus stop at the end of the estate's winding drive. Still in my funeral clothes, suitcase half-zipped, soaking wet, holding onto a timepiece and a memory. It wasn't just a fall from grace. It was an erasure. But they forgot something. I remembered everything. Ashley didn't ask what happened. She didn't reach for a hug or say sorry or offer platitudes like, "They didn't mean it." She just handed me a clean towel, then placed a chipped mug of mint chamomile tea in front of me, with the quiet ease of someone who had done this before. The kettle still hissed behind her on the stove, and a rerun of an HGTV home renovation show played low on the television in the corner. I sank into the corner of her couch, knees tucked under the soft flannel blanket she always kept folded over the armrest. The pocket watch rested in my palm like a stone warmed by memory. My funeral blazer was draped over the back of a kitchen chair, damp from the rain but still smelling faintly of cedar and grief. Ashley sat across from me in her oversized hoodie and yoga pants, scrolling silently through her phone but not really reading anything. She was there. That was the point. We didn't speak for a long time. Eventually, I opened the suitcase. It had survived the fall better than I expected, though one wheel was cracked. I pulled out the moleskin notebook, edges frayed from years of use. I didn't open it. I didn't want to see my own handwriting yet. Not the to-do lists, not the reminders about probate meetings or Chloe's birthdays I'd never been invited to. Instead, I held up the pocket watch and stared at the engraved letters on the back. To ECW, for every minute you made count. Edward used to say, "A watch doesn't just keep time. It tells you when to move." I'd always thought he meant it metaphorically. But tonight, as I turned the smooth brass in my hand, I noticed something strange. There was a slight gap along the rim, barely noticeable, but it hadn't been there before. My thumb found the seam. I pressed gently on the sides, the way I'd seen Edward do when he wanted to wind it, but nothing happened. I adjusted the angle, pressed again, harder this time, and heard a soft, almost imperceptible click. The back panel popped open. Inside, folded neatly beneath the inner cover, was a small note and a USB drive tucked in a slim compartment. I blinked, my breath catching before I even read a word. Ashley looked up. "What is that?" "I don't know," I whispered, but Edward hid it. He hid it inside his watch. I unfolded the note. The handwriting was unmistakable, precise, slanted like calligraphy that didn't care about being formal, just legible, just Edward. If they've done what I feared, find Richard Lennox in Beacon Hill. That was it. No love, Edward, no instructions beyond that. Just the name, the place, and the implication that something had been set in motion long before his heart stopped. Ashley leaned forward. "Do you know who that is?" "No," I admitted, "but I'm about to." She disappeared into her room and came back with her laptop. "Let's see what's on the drive." I didn't hesitate. The USB was warm from my hand as I plugged it in. The screen blinked once, then opened a folder labeled Estate Emergency Ethics Protocol. Inside were dozens of files, audio clips, scanned ledgers, contracts, and one document with Edward's voice encoded as an audio message. I clicked play. "If this is being opened," he began, his voice steady, "then it means they're trying to rewrite my legacy. And if Natalie is hearing this, I know you're the one I trusted to see it through." My hand flew to my mouth. Ashley froze. Edward continued. "You'll find everything you need in these files. The numbers don't lie, but the people might. I left a trail in case Margot or Charles tried to bury what we built. And if Chloe's name appears in any of these documents, follow the money, the shell companies, the investments, the withdrawals." He paused, as if deciding whether to say more. Then quietly, "I'm sorry I didn't prepare you better, but the C doesn't care about your last name, only your balance. And you, Natalie, you always had balance." Dear friend, what would you do if you were in my shoes? I bet you can't guess what's coming next. But before we go any further, drop a 5 in the comments if you're still with me, because what happens next might just leave you speechless. I remembered the first time he said that. We were sailing off Cape Cod, and I was 12, trying to steer while panicking over the waves. He sat behind me, not correcting, not grabbing the rudder, just watching. "You're leaning too hard into the wind," he'd said. "Balance isn't about stillness, it's about listening." Now I was listening. Ashley scrolled through the other files. There were scanned documents, Edward's signature next to account transfers I'd never seen, notarized letters naming me as his successor in more than just the estate, and a ledger, pages and pages of withdrawals in Margot's handwriting, thousands at a time. One entry simply read, "Galafund Chloe." "What is all this?" Ashley asked. "A mess," I said. "But it's their mess, and they left it in writing." I clicked into a folder labeled Lennox. Inside was a scanned contract, Edward's signature, and another I didn't recognize. Financial ties to something called Grayson Development Partners, based in Beacon Hill. Ashley raised an eyebrow. "That's not a trust fund. That's a company." "And it has my name on it," I whispered. We sat in silence, letting it all sink in. The truth wasn't just buried. It had been cataloged, backed up, and hidden in plain sight. Finally, Ashley looked at me, her voice soft. "What are you going to do?" I didn't answer right away. I just stared at the screen, heart pounding. "They weren't just sloppy," I said slowly. "They left a trail." Richard Lennox replied in less than 3 hours. The subject line read, "Come in. You're not alone." I stared at the email longer than I needed to. It wasn't just the message, it was the timing. 3 hours meant he hadn't hesitated. That meant he knew something. And maybe, just maybe, he believed me. The Beacon Hill brownstone looked exactly how I remembered it. Tall windows, wrought iron railings, a brass nameplate that hadn't been polished in years. I knocked once. The door opened before I could knock again. Richard looked older, but the calm in his eyes hadn't changed. "Natalie," he said, stepping back to let me in. "Edward said you'd come." His office hadn't changed much either. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a lamp with a green glass shade, thick carpet that muted every step. It smelled like old paper and cinnamon tea. A small fireplace crackled in the corner. I let my eyes adjust. "He came to me 6 months ago," Richard said, gesturing toward a leather chair. "Told me he suspected sabotage, legal, financial, reputational." I sat down, setting the USB drive on the table between us. He wasn't paranoid. "I didn't think he was," Richard said, "but he didn't give me this." He tapped the drive once, then stood. "I want you to meet someone." The door opened, and in walked a woman with sharp eyes and sharper heels. Maribel Crane. Her handshake was brief. No smile. "I don't do small talk," she said, sitting beside Richard. "Let's see what we're dealing with." Ashley had helped me label the files. I opened the folder titled Emergency Ethics Protocol and watched as Maribel leaned forward. Her fingers moved fast, opening ledgers, flipping through time-stamped PDFs, listening to the clipped tones of Edward's voice in recorded memos. She paused on one document, a memo supposedly from Edward dated 2 weeks before his death. "Odd," she muttered. "Tone's wrong. Also..." The signature was dropped in as an image. I leaned over. "How can you tell?" She pointed. "Spacing's off. And the metadata says the file was created 3 days after the funeral. Whoever forged this didn't know how to cover their tracks." Richard cleared his throat. "Gregory's login was used to submit that memo to the board archive. We cross-referenced the credentials last night." "Gregory?" I blinked. "He was just the estate attorney." Maribel looked up. Estate attorneys don't usually access personal health evaluations and legal directives unless they're trying to rewrite them. She opened another folder. This one held email threads. Chloe's name was on multiple CC lines. One caught my eye. The subject, Request to Transfer Q4 Holdings, Weller. The body said, "We'll expedite before year-end. Use Dad's power of attorney fallback if needed." "They were moving his shares while he was dying," I whispered. "They were doing more than that," Maribel replied. "They were crafting a new reality." The room went quiet. Only the soft crackle of the fire reminded me this wasn't a nightmare. It was evidence. Pages and pages of evidence. Edward had warned them. He'd prepared for this. I remember Edward once told me he didn't just raise you to show up at family dinners. He trained you for this. That line echoed in my chest as Richard and Maribel took turns dissecting the content of the USB drive. My father had prepared for war, not with guns, but with ledgers, encrypted emails and protocols so clean they left little room for denial. Maribel zoomed in on one specific email thread between Chloe and Gregory. The subject line read, "Contingency discussion, delete after review." It hadn't been deleted. Attached was a draft of a medical concern letter, clearly pre-written, ready to be backdated if necessary. Chloe had written, "If he pushes back on the Q4 transfer, we'll say he's confused again." Gregory, use that language we discussed. Richard printed the file and placed it beside the forged memo. "We'll get these authenticated. If a digital forensic expert confirms manipulation, they're done." I found myself gripping the arms of the chair. "Can we go to court with this?" Maribel tilted her head. "Not yet, but we will. First we gather, then we strike." Her precision was surgical. She laid out a phased approach. First, send a private notice of investigation to Weller Holdings. Second, leak select evidence to the Boston Globe's financial desk. Third, secure testimony from Edward's former financial assistant, Simone, who had apparently been fired just weeks before his death without cause. "How do you know about Simone?" I asked. Maribel looked at Richard. He nodded. "I hired a private researcher the minute Edward walked in here," he said. "She found patterns that didn't add up, but we needed confirmation. You brought that." We spent hours parsing through file folders. Edward's voice surfaced again in another audio file, his tone tired but resolute. "If they try to erase Natalie, they're not just betraying me. They're betraying the foundation." I remembered that word. Foundation. The trust he set up in my name, the one Margot always called symbolic. Nothing about this was symbolic anymore. It was a roadmap back to the truth. As we closed the files, Richard poured 2 small glasses of something amber. "Your father didn't leave behind money. He left behind a mission." I didn't toast. I just nodded. My mission had begun the moment the watch clicked open in Ashley's apartment. Maribel stood to leave. "I'll be in touch. And Natalie?" She paused at the door. "You don't need to scream to be heard. The paper trail does that for you." Outside, Beacon Hill was hushed under fresh snow, but I no longer felt cold. The storm that took me out of Grayson Hill wasn't the end. It was the opening act, and now I had names, numbers, timestamps, and a voice that still guided me. They wanted to bury Edward Whitmore's legacy beneath lies. I was going to exhume every truth. The first sign they were panicking wasn't loud. It was quiet, like the hallway light at the Grayson Hill estate being turned off. The second came hours later, when I tried to log into the board portal and saw this. Access denied. User not recognized. No warning, no explanation, just a blank screen and silence. Ashley glanced up from her laptop when I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. Still nothing. They erased me, I said quietly. My name isn't on the board roster anymore. Not even as inactive, just gone. That's when I remembered what Edward used to say whenever someone tried to undercut a deal quietly. They won't come at you all at once. They'll erase you detail by detail, and by the time you notice, they'll have rewritten the whole narrative. Richard's office smelled like worn leather and old paper, comforting in the way a lighthouse might be to someone lost at sea. He glanced over the printed roster and leaned back, tapping a pen against his chin. They're escalating faster than expected, he said. Maribel didn't even look up. Her eyes were on the laptop, where she scrolled through timestamp logs. Natalie, when was your father's medical memo supposed to be finalized? Never, I said. He didn't need one. His last physical cleared him. She turned the screen toward me. Then explained this. A document. Backdated. 2 weeks after Edward's death. It described signs of increasing cognitive decline, supposedly observed by a Dr. Franklin Porter. The signature? Digital. And the metadata? Created from Gregory North's work account. I stared at it for a long moment. He never saw that doctor. We would have talked about it. Maribel gave a tight nod. They're laying the groundwork, claiming mental instability to challenge the will. This memo is key. There was something cold about how methodical it all was, how far ahead they'd planned. Chloe hadn't just posted spa selfies in Europe. While she was soaking in thermal springs, her name was showing up in transfers tied to AV Solutions, a shell firm that had received almost $400,000 from Weller Holdings in the last 3 months. I wanted to scream, but I didn't. Instead, I asked, "Is it enough?" Richard answered, "Enough to raise suspicion. But not enough to win. We'll need motive, proof of manipulation, and one undeniable trail." So we looked deeper. And that's when we found it. A discreet trust fund Edward had opened at a regional Boston bank. One I'd never seen mentioned in his usual files. When Ashley and I arrived, the banker asked for my ID and signature. Then he led me to a private room. Inside, a single folder, labeled Emergency Legacy Fund. I sat down slowly, heart thudding. Inside the folder, a letter from Edward, written by hand. If you're reading this, I couldn't stop them. But I left you this because you still have the will, and they don't. The account held just over $1.2 million, not enough to rebuild the estate, but more than enough to mount a legal war. When I handed the documents to Richard and Maribel, Maribel didn't smile. She just said, "That'll help." Then came the mediator's call, a proposed settlement meeting. I didn't expect Margot to agree, but her actual reply made my skin crawl. "We don't negotiate with delusion," she'd said. "Natalie's not well, and she knows that deep down." Maribel glanced at me across the desk. "They're making their move. Today." "Then so are we," I said. We filed for preliminary injunction against the false claims, requested forensic review of the forged medical document, subpoenaed Gregory's account activity, and contacted a former employee of AV Solutions who'd been abruptly laid off 3 weeks after the funeral. By the time the sun had dipped behind the Beacon Hill rooftops, my hands were shaking, not from fear, but from clarity. Maribel closed her binder with a snap. "They're formally challenging the will. claiming your father wasn't of sound mind when it was signed. I didn't hesitate. I pulled the printed memo from my folder and placed it on Richard's desk. Then let's dismantle it, I said, one lie at a time. The courtroom smelled like floor polish and quiet threats. I sat beside Maribel, hands folded tightly in my lap, my nails digging half moons into my palms. Suffolk County Courthouse wasn't designed for comfort. The air felt too still. The benches were too rigid. The light too honest. Chloe sat across the aisle, her pearl headband pristine, lips glossed into neutrality. Margot adjusted the lapel of her tailored navy blazer every few seconds, a tic I'd once mistaken for grace. Charles sat furthest down the row, unreadable behind his square glasses, pretending to study the courtroom decor as if it were the issue on trial. And Gregory North, calculated, neat, treacherous, sat at their counsel table, his suit sharp enough to cut through shame. Judge Elena Morales presided with the kind of measured attention that silenced even the deepest whispers. Her eyes met mine as the bailiff called the hearing to order. I gave the smallest nod. My voice would come later. For now, it was Maribel's. She stood slowly, deliberately, like she'd rehearsed this stance in front of a war mirror. "Your Honor," she began, "we present clear, documented, and deliberate attempts to undermine the legal intentions of Edward Weller, my client's late father." She clicked the remote. A large monitor came alive beside the judge's bench. There he was. Edward. In a video recorded 6 months before his death, he sat in his reading room, eyes clear, voice unwavering. "If you're watching this," he said, "then it means someone has tried to undo what I've done. They may forge my name, but they cannot forge my intent. I appointed Natalie as my successor, not out of sentiment, but strategy." I blinked fast. "Don't cry, not here." The courtroom was still. The video paused on his face, lined, weathered, focused. Maribel clicked again. Next came the audio files. We heard Edward's voice outlining business plans, noting quarterly expansions, and referencing decisions he and I had made jointly. Natalie led the vendor negotiations herself, his voice echoed. "She's learned how to think 5 moves ahead. That's what this company needs." I didn't realize I'd been holding my breath until I let it out through trembling lips. Then came the forged memo. Maribel gestured toward the printed version we'd placed in the court's records. "This document," she said, "claims Edward Weller suffered cognitive impairment in his final weeks. But forensic analysis shows it was created 2 weeks after his death, using Gregory North's credentials on a device linked to the Weller Holdings network." Gregory stood. "Objection, Your Honor. That's a mischaracterization." "Overruled," Judge Morales said smoothly. Gregory tried again under cross-examination. He insisted the memo had merely been drafted for internal use, that he had no knowledge of its final version. But metadata never lies. His signature, time-stamped access, and the IP trail left no room for escape. He sat back down, sweat pooling at the collar of his shirt. Then Maribel turned to Chloe. "We'd like to introduce financial records from AV Solutions," she said, sliding documents across the bar. "A shell company that received over $400,000 in disbursements traced back to Weller Holdings accounts, all routed post-funeral, all under Chloe Weller's consulting contract." Chloe didn't look up. Her hand trembled as she straightened her skirt. A pearl earring fell from her lobe and clinked to the floor. And then the butler spoke. Peterson had been with the family longer than I'd been alive. He'd never said more than a handful of words to me. But now, when called to the witness chair, he cleared his throat and met the judge's gaze directly. "I saw Mr. Weller, Charles, grab Miss Natalie by the hair and shove her out of the house," he said, voice low but firm. "I should have said something sooner. I thought it wasn't my place, but it was, and I'm sorry." You could hear the hush stretch like fabric across the courtroom. Charles flinched. Margot's knuckles whitened around her clutch. Chloe, still staring downward, whispered something I couldn't hear. The gavel echoed once. Judge Morales leaned forward. "The evidence presented," she said, "demonstrates a clear and deliberate attempt to undermine the last will and testament of Edward Weller. The forged documents, posthumous financial transfers, and false claims of mental incompetence reveal a coordinated effort to invalidate a lawful succession." She paused. "I rule that the will stands. Natalie Weller is the legal successor to Edward Weller's estate, holdings, and associated responsibilities. Mr. Gregory North is hereby referred to the State Bar for disbarment proceedings. The matter of criminal forgery will be forwarded to the District Attorney's office." The courtroom didn't erupt. It exhaled. Maribel touched my arm once. That was all. Peterson looked at me and nodded once before stepping down. I didn't nod back. I didn't need to. Outside, the air felt strangely soft for March. Margot stepped close, her heels sharp against the courthouse steps. "You may have won," she hissed, "but you'll never be one of us again." I met her eyes and smiled gently. Thank God. And with that, I turned away. Chloe stood by the railing, phone in hand, no filters now, no smugness, just eyes that looked tired of performing. She didn't speak. Neither did I. Some silences don't need filling. Inside, the gavel still echoed in my bones. What they tried to erase had been written deeper than ink, etched into legacy, built on truth. And truth, as Edward used to say, has its own kind of gravity. It always pulls everything back where it belongs. Chloe stood at the gates of Grayson Hill. No makeup, no car. Just a small navy box in her hands and a look that made her seem smaller than I remembered. The spring light filtered through the magnolia trees, just beginning to bloom, the petals pale and unsure. The gravel under her feet crunched softly as she took a step forward. I didn't move. I stayed at the top of the front steps, one hand resting lightly against the banister, the other wrapped around a mug of cooling tea. Edward's notebook sat beside me on the stone ledge, closed. I hadn't opened it in weeks. We hadn't spoken since the verdict. I didn't expect we ever would. But here she was, walking slowly, her shoes leaving no impression in the gravel. She didn't smile. I didn't either. When she reached the bottom of the steps, she paused, looked up at me, and held out the box. "I bought them back," she said simply. Her voice was hoarse, like she hadn't used it in days. "Dad sold them years ago, said no one wore cufflinks anymore, but he wore these to every board meeting." I didn't reach for the box right away. For a second, I thought about asking her why. Why now? Why bring them to me? Why choose this moment to peel back something that had always been lacquered in distance? But instead, I just nodded once and took the box. Inside were the cufflinks, silver, etched with the faint initials EW, scuffed at the edges like they'd lived a life far beyond boardrooms. They looked like him. Not the version they painted over with phrases like decline and unfit, but the man who taught me how to hold my ground and how to recognize silence as power. "I didn't know what to say," Chloe added. "Not at the courthouse. Not now, really." "You don't have to," I said, my voice quiet. A pause. "He used to say I was the shine, and you were the structure," she said, her eyes falling to the steps between us. "I hated that. I didn't want it to be true." She looked up again. "But maybe it was. Maybe it still is." I didn't correct her. I didn't invite her in either, and she didn't ask. Instead, she nodded once, like we'd just completed something that had been waiting a long time to finish unraveling. Then she turned and walked back the way she came, still alone, but somehow less brittle. When the gates closed behind her, I stayed where I was for a while. The box was still in my hand. Later that afternoon, I unlocked the drawer in Edward's old study. I placed the cufflinks inside and locked it again. Not because I needed to preserve them, but because closure, I've learned, isn't about the object. It's about what you no longer carry with you. I sat on the balcony with my tea, doors open wide. The light was warmer now, soft against the wooden floor. No grand declarations, no revenge speeches, Just spring air and a different kind of stillness. I didn't burn bridges. I just rebuilt mine, with my name on the deed. Chloe didn't ask to come in, and I didn't invite her. But in that quiet moment, we both let go of something we'd held too tightly for too long, our pride and the old roles we used to play. I've come to believe that justice doesn't always arrive with a gavel's echo in a courtroom. Sometimes it comes softly, when you can close an old drawer, take a deep breath, and move forward without bitterness. In life, some wounds aren't healed by apologies, but by choosing to live differently. If this story reminded you of someone who left or came back, feel free to share your thoughts below. Someone out there might be waiting to hear your story. And if this story spoke to you and you believe in quiet victories, personal growth, and stories that matter, make sure to subscribe to the channel. There's so much more ahead, and I'd be honored to share it with you.